Dr. Carroll Quigley, in his work Tragedy and Hope, has mentioned the perspective that the ideas of individualism and individual liberty, which have developed especially later on within the Western political and philosophical traditions, have been gradual developments from certain ideals, such as certain Christian ideals. For example, the idea that man is made in the image of God. He also discusses the answer of both as the answer to fundamental conflicts that have played out in the Western tradition that have led to subsequent developments. For example, the conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism led to a kind of not necessarily synthesis, but a kind of mature, nuanced understanding of the positives and negatives of both, with overall the end result being that the state should not be involved in the affairs of religion. And so he discusses this kind of pluralism of approximations to the truth as being concepts that have developed within said tradition. He hoped that our current age, defined by being a post World War II one and the experiences and atrocities that defined that war, that would pave the way for the West, for the Western world, to continue upon the patterns of inclusive diversity. Dr. Carroll Quigley lived at the beginning of this era, in particular during the post World War II boom. However, it seems that this age of inclusive diversity in the West is soon coming to an end. Nevertheless, for Dr. Carroll Quigley, the West is represented by certain humanitarian aspects, more so than the scientific and technological developments that have occurred within it. Now, of course, this is subject to debate. Some may assert that the notions of liberty that have developed within the West are in fact breakaways from Christianity, breakaways from religion. Others may assert that the West is in fact hypocritical and uses these supposed humanitarian aspects as simply ideological cover for its crimes. Of course, there is a nuanced and complex reality at play here. Whilst the West has indeed developed these concepts and contributed to their development over a long period of time, it has been hypocritical and in fact gone directly against these in many, many cases. Nevertheless, what we do have to appreciate and understand is how certain ideas within this, let's say, quote unquote, Western tradition have contributed to these ideas of individualism, of individual liberty, for example. It's thus important to note the role of Christianity in developing these ideas. Now, of course, there is a nuanced reality at play here. Organized religion can contribute to the repression of the individual, the repression of individual liberty, and, limiting what a person can do. And there's no doubt about that. Religious teachings can be used in this manner, or they can actively participate in this kind of manner. However, at the same time, it's important to note that religious teachings, certain religious fundamental tenets or certain religious principles can contribute to different ideas of liberty and contribute to the development of said ideas of individual liberty. And within the Christian context, this is apparent. For indeed, despite organized religion having been a tool for the repression of the individual, certain Christian teachings can be seen to contribute to the development of ideals of individual liberty, of individualism, and some of these are very important to note. For example, one of the most important is this idea of man being created in the image of God. And the simple explanation here is that if you believe that the individual form of man is created in the image of the divine, then that individual form has an inherent dignity, an inherent value, and he is therefore endowed with certain rights and responsibilities, and he fundamentally reflects the divine, albeit in an imperfect, fallible, limited manner. For example, if we look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church by Geoffrey Chapman, we find, for example, on page 81, that being in the image of God, the human individual possesses the dignity of a person, who is not just something, but someone. He is capable of self-knowledge, of self-possession, and of freely giving himself and entering into communion with other persons. On page 384, it is further written in this work that by free will, he is capable of directing himself towards his true good. He finds his perfection in seeking and loving what is true and good. By virtue of his soul and his spiritual powers of intellect and will, man is endowed with freedom, an outstanding manifestation of the divine image. Furthermore, man, enticed by the evil one, abused his freedom at the very beginning of history. This is referring to the story of Adam and Eve, and this has important implications regarding the discussions of free will, its usage, and fundamentally that whilst man has liberty, liberty is not a license to immorality. Liberty is not a license to do what is wrong, but rather it emphasizes the responsibility and accountability of man to do what is right. Also, in man, true freedom is an outstanding manifestation of the divine image, etc., etc. On page 388, it is mentioned that man is rational and therefore like God. He is created with free will and is master over his acts. And there are many, many quotes in this regard. For example, on page 390, taking in the context of the economy of salvation, economic, social, political, and cultural conditions that are needed for a just exercise of freedom are too often disregarded or violated. This can demonstrate how, for a Christian, right, somebody who perhaps believes that he's the reflection of the divine image, not just on an individual level, but also on a social level, he must strive for the conditions through which liberty of the individual can be achieved. And so, this idea of the liberty of the children of God, this idea of where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, is a crucial part of Christian teachings, both in the Catholic perspective and now touching upon the Protestant perspective. For this more Protestant, perhaps liberal Protestant perspective, I will be borrowing from William Barclay's The Plain Man Looks at the Apostles' Creed. For example, he quotes Whitman's Leaves of Grass, this particular couplet that health, peace, salvation, universal, is it a dream? The discussion of salvation, whether it is universal or not, is important because, if you believe in universal salvation, it can help inform ideas of, certain ideas being correct or not, and how that will influence the extent to which a society gives its individuals the liberty to practice different ideas. This, of course, does not mean that if you don't believe in universal salvation, that you don't believe in individual liberty, right? That's not what I'm saying. But it is important to note that there can be a kind of correlation between believing in universal salvation and that, these different people with their different ideas have the liberty to live by them. For example, he mentions that belief in universal restoration is no new belief and no modern heresy. It has always been deeply rooted in the thinking of the church. This also goes back to what I said earlier about Dr. Carroll Quigley's emphasis on pluralism, on approximations to the truth within the Western tradition. These ideas can contribute to that as well. He, for example, William Barclay brings the figure of Origen, the exponent, perhaps greatest exponent of this belief, the first one to do so, responding to the pagan Celsus, that he neither denied the fire nor the torture, but he held that they were purification as well as punishment. He even went to the extent that rebellious angels, even Satan himself, will be saved, brought into willing submission to God. He further brings differing opinions on this, such as eternal punishment, conditional immorality, and universal restoration, right? And William Barclay says regarding these that no one is going to be dogmatic about this. But he also mentions that a father who can never be content with even a single child of his is outside the circle of his love. And so hence, right, this love, this mercy of the Father in Christianity encompasses all for them. Now, of course, this is a more liberal Protestant perspective, and I'm sure that most, let's say, Orthodox Christians, those from other Protestant denominations or from Catholic or Orthodox denominations will disagree with this. But the point being is it's interesting to know how these different ideas, how these different religious viewpoints contribute to notions of individual liberty, of pluralism, of approximations to the truth, of individual liberty, regardless of whether they are orthodox within the bounds of orthodoxy or perhaps they are not so. And of course, it's not so simple that Christian teachings have only led to ideals of individual liberty. That's absolutely not the case. In fact, certain religious teachings may be used or may actively support ideals of quote-unquote authoritarianism or quote-unquote repression. Again, these terms are quite loaded, so they have to be understood with a degree of nuance and complexity. The same can be said about other faiths, such as the Islamic faith, Hinduism, Sikhism, Judaism, etc., etc. Inquisitions, wars, conflicts, schisms. History the history of religion has been filled with these, and they can't be downplayed. At the same time, we have to understand how certain religious teachings or certain religious ideals further advance conceptions of liberty. This may be understood in the terminology of the Marxist materialists when they talk about the dual nature of religion, such as Engels, or for example, even neo-Marxists such as Maduro. But it may be understood also in the terms of somebody like Paul Johnson, who is this kind of right-wing libertarian type. He's not very sympathetic to leftism or communism. And he talks in his work Modern Times. He discusses this kind of paradoxical nature of organized religion, that organized religion can be a tool to resist repression, and it may be used to assist this kind of repression as well. In any case, it is important to understand how certain religious teachings can give rise to certain ideals, promoting concepts of liberty.